All right, so I'm gonna get started. I know there's a little group, a small group here, but at least for this one, we'll record it and go on. Um, this may not go the whole hour, which is fine, but I felt that budget, as Cameron said, it's perfect timing right now. Um, Dealing with what we're going to be dealing with in the next few weeks. If you've never gone through it before, it's a little daunting task. But what I want to give you today is a basic understanding of what goes into building a budget and the little back office items that you should become familiar with. So right now we can say this is the season. You know, we all start our budgets now. December is the season, but depending on what you have for software, you may or may not be the one that's entering that information on the software. It could be your administrative assistant. It could be someone in the purchasing office where you just give them a sheet of paper. But for the most part, it's all based on software packages now, and information that gets entered needs to be done manually, unfortunately. And the one thing when data entry goes, and we don't talk about the actual data entry into your system because I don't know what system you have. Like, for example, we use WinCap. That doesn't matter what I use, but when we do enter information, the one thing to understand is whatever you're entering needs to be precise. So there could be a very long description in the subject area about what you need. The other thing you need to remember is pieces. Is it each? Is it a set? Is it one? Is it by the square foot, the square yard? So knowing those abbreviations when you're ordering something can save you a lot of problems. I always go back to the old Laurel and Hardy March of the Wooden Soldiers thing at Thanksgiving time, where they wanted a thousand or 6,000 1-foot soldiers made by Laurel and Hardy, and they ended up making 1,000 6-foot soldiers. And maybe it saved the day, but it won't save the day for you if you get it wrong on those ends. So the specific codes that are used in New York State are universal, and we're going to show you about that. But only a few really pertain to athletics or PE. State contract items we'll talk about a little bit, and how they're determined. We'll talk a little bit about that too, because you keep hearing things about state contract. And I apologize, obviously, if this is going to be redundant for some of you, but I think it's also a little bit of a good reminder about what goes on. So the major codes, the major categories that we deal with, transportation is a bear. It's number one in the cost that you're going to be expending into your athletic department budget. So thinking about what it's costing you to do a trip right now, you may or may not know what it costs, but in this area, Long Island and Westchester, that's surrounding southeast New York, it could be as much as $600 to $700 for a game trip, to have a contract bus do that game trip. If you have an in-house bus, it's probably along the lines of $350 to $400 per trip, and that's based on salaries, fuel cost, any other expenses, salary and benefits, I should say, for the drivers. The next one is instructional. You'll see budget codes related to your instruction. That's the qualified teacher with the instructional aids and the supplies that go along with instruction. So there's a separate little code for that. Curriculum and staff salaries, training and curriculum, the curriculum development, more for the bigger subjects, science, math, English, may have more curriculum items than you, but you still have a right to have a budget code that relates to curriculum. And then facilities, of course, which is something that, you know, we handle. Now, the question you would ask is, do you handle all the budgeting for repairs and facilities, or is that done by the facilities department? That's a fine line in some areas. Some facilities people don't want to blow up their budgets, so they leave it to athletics to take care of redoing the gym floor, let's say. So you would budget accordingly. Certainly you would get quotes from the people that facilities would use ultimately, but you may have that in your budget too, so be wary of that. This is a quick little snapshot of how many codes were in my school district, and I mean, it's an old one back in 2012, 13. It hasn't changed, but this is what the budget codes look like, and it explains what each one goes to. And again, this is just a quick little snapshot, but you'll see how it's broken out. And this may be broken out that way in your district. It may be using periods. It may be using stars, height, whatever their entry code software wants you to enter, that's how they mix it up. This ATH here obviously means athletics. In your district, you could have a number code assigned to that, usually a 3-digit code assigned to that. So we're going to break the numbers down in the next couple of slides and show how each one and what they mean. So the code's in the beginning. So you see that first code is a 2110 code. It's a 2000 code. Now, these are the two codes you'll see the most, 2000 and 5000. You won't see the 1000s and the 3000s in your budgets necessarily. They're pertaining to other items that are like the superintendent's office, perhaps, or special ed codes are a little different. But these are your instructional and curriculum codes in the beginning, and then the 5000 codes are your transportation code. So it doesn't matter whether they're own buses or whether you have contract buses, you still need to budget money within that code for transportation. So what usually happens is it's an estimate. You're not going to know exactly how much things are going to cost because of cancellations, because of additions. So what you usually put in there is a general idea from the year before. Is it done seasonally? Is it done yearly? But a general idea from the year before, and add a few percentage points onto it, whether it's a 2%, a 5%, or perhaps even a 10% to give you some cushion. Now, we talk a little bit about people cushioning things, and that's one of the pitfalls of a budget, how much of it is exact and how much not. Well, there's no way on God's green earth we can anticipate everything that may or may not happen. So they create contingencies within to allow you to put money away in the case of those contingencies, because what happens to it, if it's not used, it'll get rolled into the next budget. So it's nice to have these things in place. And you'll see that as you go along, that there may be something like, let's say you do a purchase order for, in the past, to have the baskets in the gymnasium re-greased, the pulleys re-greased or whatever, or changed out or cleaned or tightened the rims. You have a company come in to do that. You don't necessarily have to do it every year, but you might want to have that $1,500 continually in that account code, because there could be a need later. But again, I'll show you that in a little bit. But it will get rolled into the next year, and now you have a consistent flow where work can be done. Might be something else related to that that's not necessarily what you did the year before. But the 2000 code, the 5000 code, those are the biggies. The next set of numbers in there, the 23, and in our case, the ATH, that 23 is usually related to a building code. In some districts, they could do 0, 1 through 10 for their 10 buildings. In our case, we have different nomenclatures for different buildings. It doesn't matter, not to confuse you. The second set is obviously set up there to let you know what department it goes to. If it was the main office in the high school, that code may be listed MAO. If it's the business office back at district office, and that's the code, it could be BUS or a specific number designated for that particular section of the school. And again, it allows the schools to form their own budgets. And at the same time, it allows overseeing areas like the business office a chance to put codes together to help support those codes. So it could be a similar one all the way down. It's just going to be a different building and a different nomenclature for the description of the department. That last code on the end, various entities use it for different things. For years and years and years, we didn't use it at all. It was 3 zeros. Then they put 3 9s in there, and that was start to designate intramurals. Let's say wanted a 999 code just to separate it so people could pull that out when they do a report. Now, when you get all these items in there, you'll see that you can pull out and do reports, and usually that's for encumbrances and unencumbered, but that's a separate story into itself, but it's something you should always have access to. You should always have access to your budget codes and to see what's being spent, what hasn't been spent. I'm going to repeat that again later. The last one, and the more specific coding, deals with the 100s, 200s, 400s, and 500s. Those are standard codes. That's a New York State controller, and you saw on the opening slide, I credited Mr. DiNapoli with stealing some of his things for this presentation. But Codes like the 2000 and 5000, that's standard in New York State. 100, 200, 400, and 500 are standard codes in New York State. The 100 codes are salaries. Anything to do with how you're paying people goes through that code. You can number it anything in the 100s you want. It's up to the person who's setting up the accounting originally, and you would end up inheriting that. The 200 is an equipment code. That's a special code. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The 400 code is a little bit more of your meat and potatoes in the department of the things that you do. It's a contract service code. It does possibly include travel and conference for you. We'll discuss that because we break them out a little bit. And the last one is the supply code, which may be, not counting salaries, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, because those are all the basic supplies. But there are parameters for each one. And you're going to say to me, what's the difference between equipment and supplies? And I'll explain that in a few seconds. So, equipment code. These are for your major items. Grounds might need a dump truck. You might need a golf cart. Grounds might need a gator to pull the drag around on the baseball field, or some field maintenance items, large purchases. I said the 7-man sled before. Does that fit into equipment? It may or may not fit into equipment code, but you have to be careful about what you do put into a 200 code, because that is voted on by the taxpayer. So when the budget is voted, anything that's in a 200 code in the budget automatically is voted on by the taxpayer. And if they ordered a 2022 Ford International bus on that for it, that's what they have to buy. They can't go out and buy a Bluebird or a Thomas bus. They have to buy what was approved in the budget. And there's no deviation from that. You cannot alter it once it's approved. You can't add money to it. You can't transfer money out of it. The bells go off. That is because it's a taxpayer voted on item. Now you might say, well, the taxpayer votes on the entire budget, but there's also discretion within the budget, because we have a fiduciary responsibility to get the best possible price for something. So if something comes along that we need to buy during the year, they trust us to take the money that they voted to approve and apply that in a purchase that's responsible. Now you're going to say, well, why can't I change things? What if the item isn't there? That's a different story. Let's say we order that bus and the bus can't be built for whatever reason because they can't get the parts from China. And can we deviate from that at that point? Yes, we can, with approval by the state. So the state authorizes us to be able to make that transfer, to be able to make that move, and then we can go purchase outside. And again, we run into these things with equipment all the time where it's difficult because prices do change. Can money be added to it to alter a price in case there's a price increase? No, because once the purchase order goes out for approval, they're locked into that price. State contract comes into play because these are all 99% of the equipment buys that we make are on state contract. And what that means is that a company sets a price on an item that they have, and they guarantee that price no matter what. So they cannot deviate from that price. They cannot change it. There's no bait and switch on it. You have to get that particular item. So it's very important that, again, we go back into those descriptions, that when we are looking to buy items like equipment, especially equipment, that we buy those things on state contract, because then you're not worried about getting bids, although your purchasing agent might have you still get 3 bids because the item is expensive. Usually that occurs another way, and we explain that a little bit too. So that's the equipment code. So just understand that that's something you may or may not deal with when you buy something. But if you do have a major purchase that you're making for the athletic department or the physical education department, it's going to fall into this code. So you always have to be sure about what you do. The contract service code, that's where all your back office money sits. It sits in with officials. It pays your dues to NISVA and to your local section. Any sports fees for how many sports you play and the fee charged to those. Any assessments that may go on. Some sections pay for their membership for New York State AAA and National AAA. You may be fortunate to have that for you. If that's the case, that would be in your assessments, and it would come out of a 400 code when you're assessed from the section. That's how they kind of backfill. And what they do in those cases is just add to it. Equipment repairs, if they're in your line, would fall into that 400 category, and travel and conference would fall. Well, now, why does travel and conference fall in there? Because it's a reimbursable, and you're going to be reimbursed based on using an outside vendor to do what you had to do. In other words, your hotel stay or your flight. Now, they do have a responsibility to reimburse you for travel with fuel, even though you're using your own car. You can certainly rent a car and get reimbursed for it. I would advise people to rent a car because it's cheaper to the district. You can always sell that a little better. Uber costs now. Everybody's using Uber. Nobody's really renting anymore when they get to a place. They'll Uber wherever they have to go. And that also is a great thing for you to do for your district when you go to travel, but know that it all comes out of this code. Last one is the 500 code. The unfortunate thing about the 500 code is it might be the first one that gets cut or frozen in the year. They say you can't buy anything. How many times is ADs that I've heard, or Steve Young's here right now, and he's heard that we can't buy anything after January 1 because they went a little overboard in September, October, November, and they need to save some money. Happens all the time. So what happens in that case? Well, you always have to go back in and petition because you may need lacrosse balls or baseballs in the spring. So it seems silly to freeze your supply budget, but in a lot of cases it is frozen. And you just have to know how to be able to go back in and say, hey, I still need this open for whatever reason. But supplies usually is the one. It may even be cut prior, because when you start getting items from your teachers and from your coaches that they need, you look at your budget to budget increase, and there's always going to be a problem in budget to budget increases. But we get into this land of the three bids. That's usually where it happens. Now, your policies can be different. In some cases, let's say, for example, the football team wants to buy new uniforms. Well, that's pretty good. And that's going to be a big ticket item. And let's say each uniform is $100 and he needs 50 uniforms. So now we've got a $5,000 a buy that needs to happen. And it's over the threshold. And again, the threshold is whatever your district sets as the threshold before you need to get those three bids. Let's say that threshold is $1,500, for example. Fine. You'll have to go out to a company and get three bids. And the purchasing agent is going to look at it and say, okay, fine, we're taking the lowest bid. But the lowest bid may not always be the best bid because of the quality of the product that you want. So you may have to go in and pitch that to your purchasing agent to say, listen, we're buying these uniforms. They have a 3/4 inch seam. The other products only have a 1/4 inch. We've got some reports that these uniforms tear. They only last 2 or 3 years. This is a buy for at least 5 or 6 or 7 years. So you may have to go in and sell that, but you can get what you want based on those particular calls that or quotes, because each vendor is going to be different in what they do and the quality of their product, but you have to do your homework on those things. There's ed data, which are standard list items that are every buys, everyday pencils, pens, paper, cheap basketballs, cheap softballs, cones. There's always items within the ed data or state, and those are, it's also part of the state contract list, but those are predetermined items. They're cheap as heck. I don't recommend using ed data for anything because they can substitute in ed data. They can sit there and say, well, you ordered a Wilson 1000 basketball or whatever the basketball is, or this, I'm sorry, the Spalding 1000, and then you get Spalding 100s. Well, I ordered 1000s. Well, sorry, we don't have 1000s, but you get the items anyway, and we have a lot of 100s. So you can bait and switch in ed data. It's illegal in retail, but somehow it's legal in the state. So we avoid ed data as much as we possibly can. Now, if your purchasing agent is forcing you, into using ed data, that's fine. But just know that you can go back and use other methods to get the product that you need. But you're always going to have to use a justification model in order to get those things. But even with the stuff that you buy, let's say you ordered something from BSN. We ordered, well, I'm not going to use field hockey because long strength is the standard buy. But let's say we ordered hockey sticks for phys ed, the plastic ones for phys ed, and you ordered the adult size. Those are the 5-foot ones, and you ordered them in red and blue. Well, let's say they're out of red and blue. They substitute yellow and green. That's fine. I can live with that. But all of a sudden, you get the youth stick, and they say, "Well, that's a substitute." Well, no, that's not a substitute. That's the wrong item. Well, we can't give you the item. You're going to have to stick with these. Now you got to send them back. Now you've got to try to get the new ones in, or you'll order a name brand item that's in BSN's catalog, and they'll send you a knockoff item. So you have to be careful of these things when you get them. If you're not checking in your equipment, then you're going to find these problems occur. Once I stopped checking equipment in, that's where the problem started, because the person in facilities who was doing the check-ins and receiving, which is great. I mean, meticulous, knew everything, but didn't know the difference between one product and another. And when we got an inferior product as a substitution, she didn't read it that way. So we would accept them. And once accepted, it's very difficult to send them back. Last thing you want to be able to ask people is, do your teachers and coaches really need the item? Yeah, and again, you're going to look for the ones that have recidivative buying habits, where it's the pack rat and the hoarder mentality, where it's not my money. I'm just going to order the same thing every year, even though I've already got enough. I did a clean out one time of a track coach. I always love telling this story, but I did a clear out of a track coach. I found 144 batons, and I found 36 stopwatches and 40 tape measures. And it was my third year here, and it took me 3 years to catch on that that's all he did was submit the same PO request every year for the same stuff. And just no rhyme or reason, but there are people that do those things. Now, it sounds a little old school, like that's the old, the World War II mentality or the Depression mentality of keeping, 1,000 cans of food in your lower basement, the bomb shelter. That's the same mentality applies in school districts. You'll open up the closet. How many times do you open up the closet for storage to get a pen? And there's 50 packs of pens there. I mean, I don't know if there's an expiration date on pens, but certainly there's enough of them everywhere to supply every school district. One closet could probably supply every school district in your area. But just remember, do they really need it? So you want to separate the things that they know they really need, that they really need, and then what's on their wish list. So we keep that separate. Purchase orders, just to say what a purchase order actually is, it's a guarantee to pay. We are guaranteeing to the vendor that we're going to pay them. So, but before that happens, we're going to need a quote. Now, does the quote come in the form of what's in the catalog? In the case of budget development, yes. So we're using catalogs initially. Your teachers coaches should have them now in their hands, looking through their catalogs. They're going to give you those items, list them down what they want. But once they get those are considered full quotes. And you've done your due diligence, you've gotten your 3 bids, and everything's fine. In the budget development, BRQs are created. That's a budget request. So when you do your budget request, you're creating these BRQs. So they're getting the actual PO numbers. So it could be a BRQ 22, because that's the year, in essence, the next budget will be 23, and dash and a certain amount of numbers could be the way you list your POs. But that number actually does get created. It then becomes a PND after this initial pre-approval, which is pending, and it keeps that same number. And then on July 1, they become full POs, and it'll be PO dash 23 dash whatever. And those things they go out to the vendors, and the vendors fill those purchase orders. If you have to do something in season, it's really the same thing, but you're actually going to get more times than none, because of your need, a physical quote, unless it's, of course, a catalog item. But make sure you're calling to get the guaranteed price on the quote. that's in the catalog. You need to make sure about that. Once those things are received, the invoice is then approved for payment. There's usually a net 30. School districts try to be good with that. Most companies want try net 30. Some want net 15 to have payment. That's probably not going to happen because the board has to approve all expenditures. No district office person has the right to approve something for payment until the board sees it technically. If it's an emergency situation, the purchasing agent, with the approval of the superintendent, can push items through for purchase. In some districts, the purchasing agent may have carte blanche to approve everything. So it just depends on where you are, but understanding that there is a bit of a pecking order to get to that point. A lot of times the boards have to. All boards have audit committees now to go through these things. Before I talk about blanket, I'll say you might get a fallback on something. You might hear the words non-confirming purchase order. It's exactly what it says. A purchase order was created prior to confirming the quote. So in other words, you could get invoiced. Let's say you call your buddy down at the sports shop down the block and said, listen, I know you got a dozen softballs down there, some Dudleys. I need them. All right, I need a dozen Dudleys right now, the SB12s. And can you get them to me? Sure, come down and pick them up. You go down and pick them up, you get them. Hey, I'll get you the PO. You cut the PO, you send them out the PO. He invoices you, but he invoices you for the day that you ordered though, verbally. So it's the day before the PO gets cut. That's a alarm bell going off to the auditors that, hey, you can't do that. You've got to go through the process. You've got to get a quote. You've got to have the invoice dated after the purchase order is cut. If it's anywhere in between, it's not going to work. And you get called in on it. You have to write a memo saying why you did what you did. And mea culpa, don't let it happen again. In the case of a dozen softballs, okay, it's $75. You're not going to get killed on it, but it could be a major item, thousands of dollars. And this does happen. It happens a lot. And it happens usually from people that don't know the process, and it bangs everybody up. And you saw earlier, I used Rosalind as one of the go-to people to get some information. And I did that purposely because Rosalind was the one they made the movie about. And it's the reason why we all have internal and external auditors now, because of the thievery that went on within the budget. But you can see how, if things are done without oversight, how you can get away with little tiny items such as that. Where you can buy something without any approval, where you can move money without getting any approval or any oversight. So be careful. Now, the blanket PO, you may or may not understand what a blanket PO is. It's descriptive in what it says. It covers everything within that budget code for the vendor. That you need to do those things. And I got to go back. I'm sorry. I want to go back to, well, I really don't have to. I can stay there. Just sorry about that. The blanket, staying with the blanket PO. So let's say, for example, I have XYZ Corporation that does field maintenance on my artificial turf field. And the price, we kind of know the price. It's about $3,500 each time they do it. I need it done 4 times a year. So that's $14,000. So I would create a blanket purchase order for $14,000 for them to do the work. Now, once that's eaten up, it's gone. So each time they come in, they just chip away at it. But that money is already set aside, assigned to them to be used for the things we use it for. Let's say they only do 3 cleanings. If they only do 3 cleanings, that's $10,500. I'm $3,500 to the good. It gets rolled over into the next budget. The problem is, do I get that money back in my budget? No, it goes back into the general fund. You've got to reset a blanket for $14,000 for the next year. You can also have a blanket for repairs in the weight room. That's an advised one. You don't know how much that's going to cost though, because repairs are repairs. It's going to be something where you're going to call them when you have an emergency. You don't have to get 3 bids. You don't have to get approval. You don't have to get quotes, because you've got that money already encumbered for that person. Okay, so that money's already set. They have it, it's theirs. They just got to use it up. So each time they come in to service the machine, let's say you have 10,000 set aside for that. It's a lot of money for equipment repair, but each time they come in, it's $500 or $600 each time they come in. And once that gets eaten up, you either have to increase the blanket with a transfer or use another vendor and file a new purchase order and go through a whole rigmarole. It's not good practice. Anyway, that's a blanket PO. Some final thoughts. So you need to have a precise inventory. If your inventory is not set right, how do you know that what they're going to order is needed? And the last thing you want is 144 batons and 38 stopwatches and 40 tape measures sitting in your storage area, because storage is at a premium. But remember, you want your staff to have a wish list, though. You do want to have them have items that they think they need to operate their team or their department or their classroom. It's critical that when they do ask for something, that you do your homework as well. Something like treadmills. You know, everybody, the phys ed department wants to get treadmills. Hopefully you have the space in your area to have a few treadmills. They all want Cybexes and they want this, but now there's a new treadmill out there that's a self-powered one that doesn't have a motor. It may not require as much repair. It's a couple of more bucks. It's about 7,000 or 8,000 for one of those, but that may be something to say, hey, listen, you wanted 4 Cybexes. How about we get 2 or 3 of these? So you can negotiate things based on your knowledge and your homework. Watch your budget to budget increases. Again, if you have $500,000 in your budget in this year, make sure your increase isn't 700,000 to 700,000. You'll have to trim it yourself to get it to a point where it needs to be in that 2 to 10% range, depending on your district. Your district might even say, we need a 0. They might tell you ahead of time, we got to go with a 0. So what you'll do is get everything in first, give them the caveat, all your coaches and teachers, the caveat that this could change based on what they're ordering compared. And then we'll start to itemize and start to set standards for each item, and what's a 1, what's a 2, what's a 3. And, you know, the ones, you know, if that's a 1 you need, we're going to get that. The 3s and the 4s you might not get, but be careful of going way over budget on your estimates when you're doing your BRQs in the beginning. The perpetual order we talked about, where you don't want to have just that reorder every year, unless it's something that has to be reordered every year, like mouthpieces, let's say, for football and lacrosse. You may or may not supply them now. You may tell, because of COVID or whatever, or health reasons, kids have to get their own mouthpieces. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But you should always have some on hand. Do you need to order 1,000 every year? They're cheap as heck. So maybe you don't need 1,000 every year, but maybe it's 250 to 500 mouthpieces. It's not a big item. They're good to have. And yes, do I sound like a hoarder now? Absolutely I do. But, you know, ultimately, some they either get lost, they're tough to find because of everything else, or if you didn't use them, they end up somewhere in the back of the storage area. That's why you have to know where everything is. Track your encumbrances and unencumbers for potential transfers. The 400 and 500 codes are the only codes where you have the freedom to move money out of one into the other. So if you have a surplus in, let's say, your officials code, because you're not going to know how many games you play, you put $100,000 in your officials code and you're only going to spend 80, it looks like, when you get into the spring. Even if you get to all the playoffs, it looks like you might only spend 80. And you need some supplies to buy before the end of the year because you want to spend out. You can transfer money from a 400 code into a 500 code. Yes, it does have to get approved. The auditor has to approve that transfer. 99.9 times out of 100, it gets transferred easily because there's a need. And even just to touch base on that a little bit, you know, I just said ordering at the end of the year. You may, again, checking your encumbrances and unencumbered budgets, you may sit there and say, okay, I can buy now. I'm not frozen. I can buy. Here's what I want to buy at the end of the year to spend that out, because I don't want that money rolling over and I do have these needs. And this way I might be able to cut my going forward budget by buying it today and making next year's budget look a little better. And I'll cancel purchase orders because it's before July 1. So make sure you find a way to look at your encumbrances and unencumbered budgets. And then you want to add 5 to 10% to each PO to cover shipping and any possible July 1 increases. So if you get an item that's 1,000, add $50 to it or $100 to it for potential shipping. If they don't tell you what the shipping is, we get that all the time. Like you'll order uniforms and it's great, but this isn't Amazon where you got Prime and you get free shipping. They're going to sit there and say, well, it's $270 to ship those uniforms. Oh, I don't have that in my budget. Now you have to ask for an increase of a PO done 6 months ago that's already been approved and everything else. Now you need to add shipping. So always add some type of shipping cost in. If you can't get it from the company, add it in yourself, a nominal amount of money into shipping. If it's less, great. If it's more, all right, but just make sure you're doing those things. So that's really kind of in a nutshell. I saw there was one question in chat. Sorry, guys, had to leave. Okay, that's all right. I'm going to stop my share now and come back to the full screen. I know there isn't a lot of guys here today. Like I said, everybody has meetings, but I did record this. So does anybody have any questions about this? Okay, I also put the file in the Google folder. The PowerPoint's in there. We're going to have all the PowerPoints go in there as well. I hope that's going to be good for you. And again, each week we're going to do a little something different. Next month, we're going to get into more of your sectional things. So you'll be meeting your mentors that are in your local sections from here on in. But Steve, do you have anything to say or are you on the phone? Steve Young. Steve Young looks like he's on the phone.
Trying to get organized for next week, Coach.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Is it all good?
Trying.
Okay, attaboy. Also be advised that we're going to have some LTI offerings coming up soon. We're probably going to be offering 504 next as an offering in December, and possibly a 600 course, but I'm not so sure about that yet. But that's Steve. That's going to be our next one is 504, probably second week of December, over 2 nights.
Yeah.
We'll do that one over 2 nights because it's a little bit longer course and it's a good intro to law course. But that's all I had today for you guys because I knew it would be a little light, but at the same time, this is pretty heavy stuff. So I hope this was helpful to you.
Thanks, Sean. I gotta run, everybody. We'll see you.
All right, you guys be good. All right, live long and prosper, and I'll talk to you guys soon. And always email me if you have any separate questions. But thank you.